you can just hit OK. So hello, Facebook, and hello, YouTube.
Hello, Facebook and YouTube. We do not have the familiar face of Todd DiPastino this evening, but we have the familiar face and much more younger and brighter face of his daughter, Ellie, tonight.
Well, thank you. I'm honored.
Todd's off at some other event that he had already had scheduled for tonight when we, excuse me, when we agreed to extend this in the part 2. So hold on here in another 30 seconds. I think we'll go live. I see there's quite a few people now in the waiting room, Ellie.
Yeah, we should get a good turnout tonight.
Yeah.
Looking forward to it. All right. Well, I will share this theme music here and we can get started.
Okay, thank you, Ellie. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to Guadalcanal Part 2. We do not have Todd with us tonight. Todd's off at a speaking event that he had previously scheduled when we agreed to have Part 2. So he's trusting me to carry the ball, and he's trusting Ellie, or I'm trusting Ellie, make sure I don't drop the ball. So thank you very much, Ellie, for being with us tonight.
Of course, I'm glad to be here.
Okay, great. So we here in Pittsburgh are suffering through the remains of Hurricane Ida. I look out my window and I was telling Dave Holland, it looks to me like I guess Guadalcanal might have looked like. It's all green and it's all jungle-like, so it's kind of appropriate here. But anyway, thanks very much for everybody for joining us for this part 2. Last week wasn't intended to have part 2. It's just that there's so much material to cover, and we have such a great panel of deeply knowledgeable and experienced experts on the battle or the campaign of Guadalcanal. We just thought it made sense to extend it into a second part. So to remind you, we have 3 of the 4 with us tonight. Right now, the 4th, Joe Mueller, who's the battlefield guide, a long time battlefield guide on the island, will be joining us a little bit later. He had a bit of a conflict. But first is Dave Holland. Dave, say hello, please.
Hello to everyone in Facebook and Zoom world. Hope you enjoy the session tonight.
And to remind you, Dave's the former U.S. Marine, now living in Australia, but he lived on the island of Guadalcanal for 2 years. And he's got this great YouTube site, Guadalcanal Walking the Battlefield, with dozens of fantastic videos. We showed one of them the other day, last week, and we're going to show parts of a couple more tonight. Okay. And then we also have Jeff Raker. Jeff, say hello, please.
Hey, everybody. Good to see you all again. Welcome back. And hi to everybody who's joining in for the first time.
Hey, thanks for being back, Jeff. And
absolutely.
Jeff, we remind you, I've kept a copy of his book here. He's got this great book. Everybody should go read it. Did sales go up in the last week, Jeff? Have you checked?
They only tell me that when I pester them repeatedly. So I'll see if I can find out.
Look for a big royalty check here to see.
Oh, absolutely. It's like $1 per copy. But
seriously, this Leaving Mac Behind. I just, I've read a lot of books on Guadalcanal. This was very different and incredibly in-depth with respect to the patrols of Guadalcanal. We got into the Getchy patrol last week. There's many more. No, that's the first time I've seen
my other cat. Yeah.
Get out of here. I've seen the white cat before, but anyway, it's a great book and a great service as well that Jeff has done to these missing Marines. Okay. And then we also have Jeff Ballard with us again tonight. Jeff, say hello, please.
All right, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the returning guests and all of those who are here for the first time. Welcome.
Okay, and Jeff's specialty, if you will, on Guadalcanal is the naval battles of Guadalcanal. And after we get started here a little bit, we're going to turn the program over to Jeff for 20 or 25 minutes. And he's put together a great presentation on the naval battles of Guadalcanal. And we'll get Dave and the other Jeff to help us understand the relationship between the land battles and the naval battles, of which there certainly was a very big relationship.
Absolutely.
Okay. So Ellie, did that one guest, Anne, do you see her? Is she on?
I do see Anne. Anne is with us. Hello, Anne.
Okay. Anne, please say hello and introduce yourself, and please help me with your surname because I just don't want to murder
It's a tough one. I'm Anne Chiquetto, and kind of like Geppetto. And my father was on Guadalcanal. He was with the 2nd Marine Division, L Company, 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines.
Okay, great.
And I loved the program last week, and I'm thrilled to be back here again this week.
Well, we're happy to have you. Very pleased to have you. And I understood from the trail of emails that Todd shared with me, you're writing a book about your father.
I am. It's kind of a historical novel, kind of a nonfiction novel. So I've done a lot of research, and it covers 3 periods. It covers the Depression, the Civilian Conservation Corps, and then his time on Guadalcanal. So it evolved out of a research program at the University of Washington that I did on the Civilian Conservation Corps.
Okay, great. That's
I'm almost done. I've got 3 chapters left.
well, it's incredibly ambitious of you.
It's been a long project, yes.
And I think what's interesting, and maybe we'll get Dave or Jeff to comment on this, you know, most of the time when we think of the Marines on Guadalcanal, we think of the famous 1st Marine Division.
Right.
They were the first. They were there a couple of months. That's what the movies are about normally. And we sort of forget the 2nd Marine Division, which is certainly unfortunate.
It's been really hard digging out information. And I was fortunate to do research at the Marine Corps base in San Diego and spend time there with the historian. And I have my father's book, which is, your experts have probably seen this, but this was published, I think, in 1948. And it's the story of the 2nd Marine Division. So there's a lot of good information in there. And then I have a whole library of books where a lot of it's about the 1st Marine Division, but, you know, I try to pull out the little kernels about the 2nd Marine Division and put that story together.
Yeah. Dave, do you have any videos of 2nd Marine positions that you've videoed on Guadalcanal?
Oh, yes. In fact, most of my videos, because, you know, I specialize in the land campaign. Well, the 2nd Marine Regiment actually formed one of the 3 regiments of the 1st Marine Division. Because at the time, its 3rd Regiment, the 7th, ironically, was filled out with the best NCOs and the best officers because they were expected to fight first. And they were sent into Samoa to garrison Samoa. But and you know, you had the famous Marines Hannikin and Puller in there. So, but the 2nd Marine Regiment fleshed out the 1st Marines. And what was ironic, well, for the 2nd Marine Regiment, the poor guys, they were the first ones to land, and they were the last ones to leave because the 2nd Marine Division, as an entirety, came in January 1943. So the 2nd Marine Regiment basically was part of the 1st Marine Division during the entire campaign. So they were mainly at Tulagi, and then they were brought over. The 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines, which her father was brought in October of 1942 as a division reserve. But the 1st and 2nd battalions were brought in later in the last of October and November. But yeah, they've seen a lot of combat on Guadalcanal. So
yes,
most of them
actually was brought in September, I believe, 14th or 15th. They transferred over, and they were initially supposed to reinforce on Edson's, the Bloody Ridge battle. But that was over by the time they finally landed. So I do have his military records and where he was, at various times. So, but he was the landing group on Gavutu, and they were at the base of Hill 148. And then Company K, I was fortunate to interview some of the veterans that were part of that. And so K went up the hill and were the first ones to raise the American flag there on Gavutu. So they were kind of in reserves, but really part of the big battles.
And have you managed to get a hold of a copy of Chaplain Willard's book, Leathernecks Come Through?
I have not. I know about Chaplain Willard, but I
will
be able to get a copy of the book.
Send me a message. I can send you a PDF of it. I think you'll really enjoy it.
Okay.
He was
maybe
with
in the chat, give me your information.
Sure. Yeah, he was with 3-2 on Gavutu, Tanambogo.
Yeah, in fact, I have one of his poems that he wrote that is just so touching.
Right. Yeah, he took fantastic detailed notes, and that's really fascinating subject. Really, the role of the chaplains, and how they wound up kind of picking up a lot of the slack. And one of the areas I'm particularly interested in is the establishment of cemeteries. And a lot of that fell to the chaplains because there wasn't much of a graves registration, accumulated knowledge in the Marine Corps at the time. That was supposed to be an Army thing. So Willard established the first of the 2nd Marine Division cemeteries in the South Pacific on Gavutu. Right after the battle, a lot of the guys from 3-2 were buried there.
Interesting.
And you have my email address, so just email me and I'll put the two of you together.
Okay, super.
Well, thanks very much for joining us. And please, as we work through this discussion today, if you've got some comments that are pertinent to the 2nd Marine Regiment and the 2nd Marine Division, please feel free to make a comment.
Yeah, the only one I'd mention, and Dave could probably comment more on this too, is they were part of the whaling group in the 3rd Battle of the Matanical.
Okay.
So, and I know I've seen some of Dave's photos and videos, and they're just amazing in order to kind of sort of put you in that place. So I thank Dave for all of his hard work.
His website is worth spending a lot of time on.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ann. So look, let's just touch base where we finished last week, because I know we finished late, and we're not going to finish late tonight, I promise. And we're not, and we finished kind of with a rush last week with the Battle of Alligator Creek. Dave, you commented on it at that time, and I felt a little guilty asking you to do it all in 15 seconds.
1 minute.
Well, felt like it even went faster, but so the end result, of course, I mean, it was the first organized Japanese attack on the perimeter, right? And end result was massacre of the Japanese, basically, right? Any other thoughts on that battle, or how it impacted the rest of the Japanese campaign against the perimeter?
I forgot what I said last week, but I won't spend too much time on it. Mainly, it obviously gave a confidence boost to the 1st Marine Division. I mean, they were basically a half-trained division. When they went to New Zealand in July of 43, they were expected to train for 6 months to be ready, and they were going to be the main offensive element for the U.S. Strike back. So Vandegrift, the division commander, was given 6 months to get his troops in line. I mean, a lot of the NCOs and officers of the 1st Marine Division, I mean, it was like a who's who of the Marine Corps at the time. If you look at the playlist, so to speak, of the 1st Marine Division. So the NCOs and a lot of the officers had some combat experience, so they're very well. They're the professional old breed. But most of the guys in the infantry companies joined after December the 7th. A lot of them went to basic training and boot camp in January and February of 1942. So they're very green. So, they were given 6 months. So basically the Battle of the Tenaroo Alligator Creek boosted the Marines' confidence, because it's the first time they've ever really met the Japanese. I mean, if you don't consider Wake Island with the Marines, face to face. And this is a great unit, you know, as an assault, considered an assault unit, the 28th Regiment. You know, like I said last week, they were destined to invade Midway, but obviously they didn't get a chance. So they were, they sent them to Truk Island. So yeah, it boasted the Marines. And then Japanese, it kind of gave them a setback. They're like, okay, well, they're, you know, the reconnaissance and the estimation of the Marines, you know, they only thought there's 2,000 Marines on the whole island. But then at that stage, it was 11,000. You know, and then the biggest outcomes was it boasted the Marines' confidence and ability that could defeat the Japanese if they were prepared, and the Japanese, it gave them a little bit of a setback.
What always struck me about the beginnings of the Pacific War, and illustrated here perfectly, is both sides dramatically underestimated the capability of the other side, right?
Yes.
Basically, the Getchi Patrol and all that, you know, didn't believe that the Japanese were capable of doing the kind of, you know, performing the kind of combat that they did, right? And then the Japanese, though, were equally as guilty, not thinking that, you know, the Americans were not, combat prepared, didn't have the experience, didn't have the intestinal fortitude, the guts, if you will, to perform in combat. And
yes, I was reading it.
Taught each other a lesson at this battle.
Yes, I mean, you hit the nail on the head there, Glenn, because I mean, one estimation in the Japanese intelligence was that the Western powers, not to count just Americans, but the British and the Australians and the Commonwealth, basically were feminine, and they didn't like to fight at night, and they just like to dance. I mean, it sounds quite funny, but that was an intelligence estimate that it was actually put out. And they'd been fighting the Chinese for years, so you know, they, you know, the bamboo spear tactics, like I said last week, worked quite well against the Chinese.
If I could just add a point to what Dave said, I've read that the attitude towards the Americans and the rest of the West was based on the Japanese perception of the Jazz Age back in the 1920s. The young Japanese then became interested in jazz, and the establishment, if you like, found that decadent, and that helped set the Japanese attitude towards the United States and the Western powers. This behaviour they saw during the Jazz Age, the dancing and so on.
Yeah, thank you. I'm sorry, who is that?
I'm sorry, my name's David Way. I'm from Australia, and I was fortunate enough to be on a tour with Dave a couple of years ago, which was absolutely magnificent.
Okay, great. I'd have never guessed you were from Australia.
Well, it's funny. When I was with Dave on Guadalcanal, he sounded like he was out of Gone with the Wind or something to me with his accent. Yet when I hear him compared to you guys, he sounds like one of us.
We voted Dave most unique accent already, you know. So yeah, that underestimation of the American capability to fight also ran all the way to Adolf Hitler, who was quoted, I'll paraphrase it as, I'm not worried about, you know, declaring war on those guys. They're just a bunch of jazz dancers and mixed race, you know, culture. They can't fight. They won't fight. So obviously it was wrong. So thank you, Dave. Well, okay, let's in the interest of time here, let's move on to Jeff Ballard. Jeff is our resident expert here on naval warfare in the Pacific, and specifically in this case, the Guadalcanal naval battles. So without further ado, Jeff, I'll turn it over to you and ask Ellie to put up your presentation. Jeff, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. I'm sorry. Hello, everyone. My name is Jeff Ballard. I'm a Guadalcanal naval researcher. I have a master's degree in American military history from the American Military University, and I did my master's thesis on naval combat in the South Pacific between August 1942 and November 1943, which encompasses the Guadalcanal campaign. So, Ellie, could you advance the slide? I'm not sure if we mentioned it the last time, but the Guadalcanal campaign was just the first phase of a much larger plan to capture the New Britain, New Ireland, and New Guinea area. So phase one, which was known as Pestilence, the objective was the seizure and occupation of Tulagi. However, when it was discovered that the Japanese were constructing an airfield on Guadalcanal, that then became the primary objective of the campaign. Go ahead. So I think this is a sobering slide. It really demonstrates the fact that the Iron Bottom Sound is literally the graveyard for 4 or 5 dozen ships that we know about, and literally thousands of sailors and Marines and airmen as well. Certainly there were air crews that were downed. We know there were Japanese barges that were mercilessly strafed by the pilots from Henderson Field. And as Dave pointed out in part one, at the Battle of Savile Island, approximately 1,000 men died in a 30-minute period. And that was just one of 5 battles that was fought in and around the Sound. So this is literally the graveyard for thousands of men. And I think that really puts it in perspective, the sustained violence over a 6-month period between August and January or February 1943. It really is astounding. And it's the thing that most attracted me to the study of this particular campaign, because I don't think there are very many other campaigns during World War II, either in the Pacific or in the European theater, that really can match this in any way. Ellie, do you want to go ahead and change the slide? Okay, so there's a tremendous amount of material here. I have done lectures on the various battles, of which there was 5. As I mentioned, there was 5 night engagements in or around the Sound, and then also the 3rd and 4th major carrier battles of the war were fought during the Guadalcanal campaign. So, I could talk about this topic for hours, but what I wanted to make sure that I did was to sort of talk about some themes, so that as each of you, go about your research, and as you read books, as you watch David's videos and other videos about the battles on Guadalcanal, that you really try and key in on a couple of key concepts here. And the first one is that really nothing happened in the South Pacific in the fall of 1942 that wasn't related in some way to either the reinforcement of Guadalcanal and the defense of the airfield by the Marines, or by the occupation or the reoccupation and destruction of the airfield by the Japanese. There were, at least my research didn't indicate there were any other very significant strategic initiatives during that time. It really all focused around Guadalcanal, and it specifically focused around Henderson Field. The other thing that's important to remember, and Glenn touched on it, is that the land battles and the sea battles and the air battles were very much intertwined. There was a tremendous causality between all of those 3 aspects of the campaign. And there's a slide here in a little bit that I'll demonstrate what I mean by that. I'll point out some of the examples. Another thing that you should look for is the ways in which the campaign was predictable or had a tempo. I guess a tempo is a better way to describe it. For example, there were daily air raids, and these occurred at about the same time every day because the Japanese were flying from Rabaul, which was 600 miles away, and if they left at dawn, then they arrived at Guadalcanal before noon. And so this happened regularly. There weren't air raids every day, but early in the campaign, they were very frequent. And of course, we had the advantage of the coast watchers on the islands up the Solomon's chain who could report on the progress of the Japanese air raids, their number and composition. And that gave the flyers on Henderson Field, time to prepare for it. They knew when they needed to be airborne in order to meet the raid. The Japanese were at the very, very, very end of their range. Even the Zero, which had a tremendous range, was still at the end. They didn't have much time to loiter over the target. Another thing that happened regularly were bombardments. The Japanese at night would bombard Guadalcanal with the intention of trying to destroy the airfield. And sometimes this was done by battleships. Sometimes it was cruisers. Sometimes it was destroyers who, after they dropped off their load of troops on Guadalcanal, would bombard the airfield before they turned around and headed back to Rabaul. And sometimes it was even submarines. There were instances where submarines surfaced in Iron Bottom Sound and bombarded the Marines with their deck guns. Another thing that happened regularly, if not nightly, was these harassment. The Marines were overflown by single engine and multiple engine planes, flow planes, and twin engine Army planes that dropped bombs or flares or did nothing but buzz the airfield with their, just to interrupt the Marines' sleep and cause them to, come to alert and pile into their bomb shelters. Another concept, and probably the most important early in the campaign, was the day versus night aspect of the campaign. At night, when the sun went down, the Japanese Navy ruled the Iron Bottom Sound. They until November, the battles in November, they pretty much ruled the night and did what they wanted to do with impunity. But as soon as dawn, though, the Japanese had better be gone. They had better been well on their way back to Shortland Islands or Rabaul. Or if the Henderson Field was operational, the planes on Henderson Field were going to find them, and they were going, to do their best to try and sink them. And that was true, especially if you were a Japanese captain and your ship was damaged during one of the nighttime battles. There was a good chance that the Marines and the Navy and the Army pilots were going to find you and they were going to sink you if you could not get home very, very quickly. So that's really the reason for the Japanese focus on making sure that airfield was not operational, because when it was operational, they couldn't do very much during the day without significant danger to their forces. But in those instances where the airfield was not operational, they were able to operate in the Sound in the daylight, land troops and vehicles, including tanks and heavy artillery pieces on Guadalcanal, and the Marines could do very little about it. Another thing to consider too is, as Dave mentioned, early in the campaign, the Japanese estimates of the forces on Guadalcanal were very much understated. I mean, they believed that there was about 2,000 Marines on the island when in fact it was closer to 11. They also, for the longest time, believed that the Marines were like the landing in Macon in February of 1942. This was just simply a raid. They were going to show up, they were going to destroy the airfield, and they were going to leave. And that, as we know, is absolutely not the case. It's important too to consider that very often the Japanese, the Imperial Navy, they were very bold in their strategic vision, but either became overly cautious or very reckless when it came to the tactical battles. And there was also sort of a piecemeal application of force. This is true more, in my opinion, more true on the land than it was at sea. You know, the Japanese they sent the Ichiki detachment, the 28th Infantry Regiment, and then they sent a brigade, the 35th Brigade, and then they sent a division, and then they moved the 17th Army headquarters to Guadalcanal, which sort of was their admission that New Guinea was not going to be the main focus of the war in the South Pacific. In fact, Guadalcanal is going to be the decisive battle. There's some other things that you want to look for on the US side as well, is that the ship losses were tremendous. I mean, in terms of numbers, they were about equal, but more of the Japanese ships that were destroyed were the destroyers and things like that, and that was critical to them because they needed a lot of their destroyers. They needed their destroyers for combat, for convoy duty and things like that. But as you'll see, 12 of the 14 heavy cruisers that the Navy deployed to the South Pacific were either sunk or severely damaged, and I mean severely. I'll show you some pictures in a little bit. Another thing that you want to look for is the tactics that the Navy employed. Were kind of outdated at this point. The admirals who got their flags, were in the interwar years. They were from the peacetime Navy, and they were very much steeped in the naval theories of Mahan. And like the Japanese, they believed that the war in the Pacific was going to be a climactic battle at the very end. So we can talk a little bit about that. Go ahead and advance the slide, please. Okay, as Glenn mentioned, everything is very much intertwined here. The land battle begat the naval battle and vice versa. Here's some examples of, obviously the airfield construction resulted in the first Marines landing on Guadalcanal. The Battle of Alligator Creek, resulted in the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, which was the third large carrier battle of the war. The Japanese intention there was that Ichiki was going to capture the airfield, and then the convoy, the troop transports which accompanied the combined fleet, were going to land and reinforce the Japanese on Guadalcanal. Obviously, the 3rd Brigade and Kawaguchi landing at Tasamboko, that he was directly involved in the attack on Bloody Ridge in September. Now, Cape Esperance, which I'll touch on briefly, was a marginal victory for the United States Navy, the first one really, but it didn't prevent the Japanese from returning 3 nights later, and really knocking Henderson Field out of action for all intents and purposes. Another carrier, the fourth carrier battle of the war, the Battle of Santa Cruz Island, that was the result of the Battle of Henderson Field. I understand, I've heard a number of stories, but there was at one point, the Japanese, some of their soldiers actually made it to what they believed was Henderson Field, was actually the auxiliary fighter strip. And they set off a green flare, which was the signal that they had captured the airfield. So the headquarters on Guadalcanal radioed the combined fleet and told them that the airfield had been captured, and that triggered the troop convoys with their carrier escorts to take off to leave for Guadalcanal, again with the intention of occupying and reinforcing their victorious troops on Guadalcanal. So those are just a couple of examples of how the land battle begat the naval battle and vice versa. Go ahead and change the slide. Okay, so I mentioned there was 5 major night surface actions. We talked a little bit about the Battle of Savo Island last time. It was the worst defeat in the United States Navy's history. But 2 months later at Cape Esperance, Admiral Scott flipped the script on the Japanese, and he destroyed, completely surprised and destroyed a Japanese cruiser and destroyer force who was intending to bombard Henderson Field. As I mentioned, this was a marginal victory for the Americans. It was a huge shot in the arm, obviously. But in the long run, I think it had a negative effect because it sort of lulled the Navy into its complacency. They thought, okay, well, maybe Savo Island was just, that was just an outlier. Look what Scott did at Cape Esperance. See, we had it right all along. The big gun, the Black Shoe Navy, the gun club, we got it right. So let's just do that. Let's just repeat Scott's tactics over and over and over again. And you'll see that they did that, but they didn't get the same result. So then in November 13th, which happened to be a Friday, there was a particularly noxious Tokyo Express with battleships that was, again, intending to bombard Henderson Field. There were 2 cruiser destroyer task forces available at the time. One of them was Admiral Scott, and one of them was Admiral Callahan. Callahan was placed in the main tactical commander. Although Scott had been the victor at Cape Esperance, the 2 admirals never met. They never formulated a cohesive battle plan. Callahan was put in tactical command. Simply because he outranked Scott by like 3 days or something like that. So that battle was an absolute disaster. There were all sorts of problems with the formation, with the selection of the flagship, with radar. Callahan did not put his flag in the ship with the most capable radar. As a result, there were tremendous communication problems as the tactical circuits became overloaded. And he didn't maneuver his columns for advantage. Instead, he chose a head-on collision. He smashed into the Japanese. And they fought at literally side-scraping distances. There were instances where there were destroyers attacking battleships, and the battleships, they were so close that the battleships could not depress their guns low enough to get a shot off at the destroyers.
Hey, Jeff.
Yes.
Can I say something on that one? Mate, sorry
Yes.
to interrupt. If you go to my Guadalcanal on one of my videos. It's called the U.S. Memorial Guadalcanal. About halfway through, when I used to take people up on tours for this particular naval battle, I would show them the fighting area. It's very, very small, and it's a good indication of that. If you go to that video, it's a very small area, very small, and it's amazing when in America had 13 ships and the Japanese had about 13 in that small area. And when they the fellow said it was, the one Navy captain said it was like a ballroom brawl with the lights turned out. But yeah, if you go into the video, you can really see the fighting area. Right. Thanks, Mike.
Yeah, Callahan put his ships in a single column, all 13 ships in a single column. I think it was like 8 miles long or something like that. And so trying to maneuver a column that long in such a confined space, there was, there was definitely some problems, definitely some doctrinal problems as well. It's also important. It's also, I think, important to know that both Callahan and Scott were killed in that battle. Scott was killed by friendly fire. His flagship, Atlanta, was hit by shells from the San Francisco, which was Callahan's flagship. So then a couple of nights later, you've got the naval battle for Guadalcanal. In the background here, you'll see this is a painting of the USS Washington. This was the joust of the giants. This is the first battleship engagement since 1898. It was a success in the sense that it really proved radar gunnery. Admiral Lee, who was the admiral in charge on the USS Washington, he was the Navy's foremost expert in radar-directed naval gunnery. And the negative then was the destroyer losses were high because these gun club admirals really used their light forces as torpedo bait. The Washington, the Washington was not damaged, and during the battle, the South Dakota, who was with the Washington, was not damaged either, but it experienced all sorts of mechanical or electrical faults, and they both Admiral Lee decided to exit the battlefield because he was concerned that his big ships were going to be sailing into torpedo waters. The last night battle I wanted to touch on was the Battle of Tasa, Flaranga, which was the second worst defeat of the United States Navy history. And that really suffered from poor admiralship. And as you'll see in a second, there was some excessive cruiser losses. So, Ellie, could you advance the slide? So this is what I mean by excessive damage. These are the New Orleans, Pensacola, and Minneapolis, minus their bows, were all damaged during the Battle of Tasa, Flaranga. So obviously these, although they weren't sunk, these ships had to return to the United States for repairs. And a lot of them had to actually transit the Panama Canal and go to the East Coast ports because the West Coast ports were full. Go ahead and change the slide. So there were also two carrier battles, the third and fourth carrier battles, the Eastern Solomons and the Battle of Santa Cruz Islands. So what I wanted to, the whole point of this slide and the previous slide was, if we look at the result of all of these battles, that regardless of the ship's losses, they succeeded in the sense that A, they either prevented Henderson Field from being bombarded, or B, they say they prevented the transports from being destroyed. So for good or, good or bad, they accomplished that goal in the sense that the Marines lived to fight another day. The Cactus Air Force lived to fight another day. Okay, you want to change the slide, please? Okay, so this is I just wanted to point out here. This is the postmortem for Guadalcanal, which turns out to be a very dangerous place. Again, as I mentioned earlier, the heavy cruiser losses are understated by about 50%. 12 of the 14 heavy cruisers that were deployed to the South Pacific were either sunk or severely damaged, requiring extended stays in West Coast or East Coast ports. Look, and if you look at the destroyer losses, also you'll see that the Navy hadn't learned what the Japanese had known for decades, and that was the value of their light forces and the ability to utilize torpedoes as an offensive weapon. At this point, and until 1943, the Navy doctrine was to hold the destroyers back as screening their capital ships, and not to use them in an offensive capacity unless there were other battleships present. And then the last thing that I wanted to point out here, and David touched a little bit the last time, was that look at the disparity between the Navy, KIA, and the Marines and Army. This was, in a lot of ways, the Guadalcanal campaign was very much of a naval battle, and the Navy, partly because this is their first engagement, since the Spanish-American War, had a lot of lessons to learn, and they were learning them the hard way.
Hey, Dave, there's a question in the chat room, which I think is a good one. Incredible damage to the bows of these cruisers. How in the world did they stay afloat? What kind of damage control was there that enabled them to get back to port to be fixed?
I think Jeff can answer that one.
Oh, I'm sorry. My fault, Dave. I did mean Jeff. I did mean Jeff. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no. A lot of them had to. They constructed false bows made out of plywood, and a lot of that work was done in Tulagi. Tulagi had a natural harbor, and so they constructed these temporary bows that allowed them to get to Hawaii, where they could have a little bit more a better solution that would allow them to get to the West Coast or East Coast ports. Now, there were instances, none of those cruisers sank, though all three of those cruisers returned to the war, but it was, like 18 months to 2 years later. There were instances, though, where ships that had lost their bows were fitted with temporary bows and then sank on their way back to Hawaii.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Let's move on to Jeff, please.
Yeah. Okay. Almost done. So I include this slide because it sort of talks about the evolution of thought. As I mentioned before, when the United States began the war, the Navy particularly, they had this professional chauvinism. They thought that because they'd been fighting the Japanese on the gymnasium floor at the War College, they knew exactly how this was going to go. And they were confident that they were ready for the Japanese. So if you look at it, here's Chester Nimitz saying in 1942, our losses are heavy and we still have no explanation why. They were really surprised. They were really shocked that the Japanese were being so soundly defeated. Nimitz in December 1942 begins to recognize there might be a problem here when the USS Gwynn fails to sink the Benham, which was damaged and dead in the water. The Gwynn fired 4 torpedoes on it, and they either missed or they didn't explode. But still, in January 1943, Nimitz thinks, well, maybe, I think our torpedoes are as good as their torpedoes. But then by July, after the campaign had moved out of the Guadalcanal and into New Georgia, he's beginning to realize the Japanese torpedoes are better. And then finally, by the end of the summer in 1943, he's realizing that they need to get to focus less on gunnery and more on the offensive capabilities of their torpedoes. Go ahead and change the slide. So that's just a brief summary of the combat in the South Pacific. And I would love to talk to anybody who would like to talk about this subject. So if you'd like to email me, I can give you a copy of this presentation, and feel free to contact me. Thank you, Glenn.
Yeah, Jeff, great. That's one of the best, brief, coherent summary of the naval battles. I learned a lot. Are there questions? And Ellie, I'm not very good at seeing if anybody has raised their hand or would like to ask a question of Jeff.
Don't see any raised hands, but yes, if you do have a question, feel free to speak up.
Please.
I'll ask the first one in the interest of getting any more questions out on the table.
Yeah, champagne for
So Jeff, there's a key change in naval leadership during this time frame.
Very much so.
With the arrival of Admiral Halsey. Could you speak to that and what impact that had on the naval engagements?
Yeah, well, that really changed, Robert Gormley was he was the first commander of the South Pacific Fleet. And he was really the wrong guy for the job. But at the time, there was very, very, very few theater commanders who were, unemployed and looking for work. I don't want to, he was his background. Gormley's background was as the naval attaché to Great Britain, so he was very, he was politically savvy, but he wasn't a particularly aggressive naval commander. And in his defense, there weren't that many. I mean, as I mentioned, most of the guys who got their flags during those interwar years were from the peacetime Navy. But when Halsey came in, and excuse my French, but he really kicked butt. And he was an admiral who was very popular below decks. All of the sailors would, they really rally around him, and they really, was a huge morale boost when Halsey took over for Gormley. Yeah.
Trey, you have a question.
Yes, I do. I have a question about Japanese naval doctrines. So as the war progressed on and on, the Japanese had this naval doctrine where they would seek out one large, big naval battle that they would win, kind of like a second Tsushima almost. And like Leyte Gulf and other stuff, like when Yamato was sent out to basically just beat itself and turn itself into a gun battery. Mm-hmm. And we mauled it to death with a bunch of bees, practically. I was wondering why they didn't try to do anything like that, where they send, I know Santa Cruz and Eastern Solomons happened, but they were fairly small compared to other large carrier and naval surface engagements. I was wondering why that is, and why they were dedicated to this strategy of just feeding the island, and not the strategy that they had developed of seeking a final battle and then using that as like a springboard, kind of like what happened in the Russo-Japanese War.
Well, you have to remember that both the Imperial Navy and the United States Navy were reading the same book. They were reading Mahan's influence of naval, the influence on history. And so both sides were really seeking, at least initially, they were both seeking that one massive engagement like Tsushima. But the two navies were going to go about it in a different way. The Japanese planned that battle would happen, the decisive battle would happen at night. The Americans assumed that it would happen during the day, and they developed doctrine and weapon systems to support those things. Now the Japanese were they were constantly trying to bait the American fleet to come out and engage in that battle. They tried to do that at Midway. They tried to do that in the South Pacific. They tried to do that later on in the Marianas. So, that wasn't just the Japanese strategic thinking. Early in the war, in the interwar years, the Navy assumed, the United States Navy assumed it would be the same way.
Excellent. Thank you. Others before we move on? Okay. Yeah.
Thank you, Glenn.
Thank you very, very much.
You bet.
Aspect of Guadalcanal that we don't spend enough time on, and that interrelationship between the land battles and
that's a really critical concept.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Okay, and I think I saw Joe Mueller pop up.
Yes, you did.
Thank you, Joe. I could tell by the palm trees. Thank you for joining us. I'm glad you can make it.
Me too.
And I would say just at the appropriate time, Joe, because now we're going to switch back to the land battle. We've all agreed in our agenda here to focus on two of the, I think, 3 Medal of Honors that are won on Guadalcanal by the Marines. Is that right? 3 were won. Do I have that right, Dave and Joe?
There was actually a number won on Guadalcanal, more than 3. There was 3 won by enlisted Marines. That's probably what you're thinking about. All machine gunners, yeah. But there was a number won by flyers, and then the 1st Marine Division, Vandergriff and Edson, and there's a number.
Right. So that 19,
was 19 in total, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. So that was the qualification I was missing there. Enlisted Marines. And interesting, they're all won by machine gunners, and all on these perimeter battles that took place. And while we can't dwell on all of those, the 2 that we thought we'd get into a bit here were one, Mitchell Paige, one, I think the first perhaps, and then Basilone right after him, right? Both from the 7th Marines, if I have that right, yeah, and both with very similar actions, but with also distinct differences, which we'd like you to draw out for us. So I thought perhaps if we could start with a couple of the clips from Dave's videos. The first one is of the Mitchell Paige action, and we'll just spend a couple of minutes on this because unfortunately, they went and built a village and a town over top of where this action took place. And so it doesn't resonate quite as well as the Basilone does. But could you start that?
If you probably go through about the first 3 or 4 minutes, if you probably started, because they were throwing rocks at me in about the first minute. So that's probably part entertaining, but still doesn't get a good feel of it. Morning. First off, hope you.
Did you say 3 minutes in?
Yeah, about 2 or 3 minutes in.
Okay.
Yeah, around in there. Yeah, that's roughly. Major offensive battles Japanese did on Guadalcanal, they couldn't coordinate their attacks, so each attack was piecemeal. So Oka attack occurred on the night of the 26th, straight up this ridge. This position I'm looking at now was occupied by Golf Company of the 2nd Battalion of the 7th Marines. That's a reverse slope. You'll notice this area, unlike my other episodes, this has been built on heavily, so there's probably no left. I doubt I'll see any reverse slope positions through there, but the Marines didn't really have much time to dig in on that night. All right, that's looking back west on the ridge line where I was just standing. So this is like a natural bow that the Marines were holding. The Japanese were attacking straight below me. So I apologize for the thickness, and you really can't see much. So Mitchell Paige, his position was on a forward knoll in front of F Company. He was put out there with a machine gun section. He had another machine gun section of 2 heavy machine guns to his left, slightly down the ridge, he said. He said it wasn't a great position for machine guns. It was the best he could do. In fact, he had to set his machine guns up at night. He said he didn't have any grazing fire, but he had some oblique fire. So let me just see if I can move in and see if we can get a better view. So through the night, Paige was moving around from machine gun position to machine gun position. So he said Golf Company was to his right, about 100 yards in a thick wooded area. So Golf Company would have been in that area there. The Japanese was coming from that area, so that's basically looking west, and that's north. Paige was on a knoll directly in front of me, so I'll go over there now. And this is the area where Paige took the machine gun from the mount with 2 belts of ammunition and led the countercharge in the dawn. I believe it's also the
Maybe
area
we
where
stop there, Dave. Is that as good a place as any to stop for now?
Yeah.
And
Yeah, that's a good place. Yeah, I mean, he had a number of positions around there with his machine gun platoon, and if you go around the corner, well, and around the corner there was a large knob, or knoll they call it, and that was where he had 2 guns there. So he had like 4 gun positions, and he ran back and forth across the knoll by himself at one stage, manning shooting each gun.
And Ellie, there's an aerial photo that Dave had sent us that shows where the actions took place, both the Paige and the Basilone actions. Could you put? Let's try the other one. I think was a little better one. There we go. I think. Can people see that? Okay?
Yeah, that's it.
There we go. So there's the Mitchell Paige action. All right.
Yes.
So maybe Dave or Joe, maybe the 2 of you, if I could ask it that way, recount for us a little bit about what happened here. This was October 22, 23. Do I have that date right? And what is going on? What are the Japanese attempting to do?
Well, I'll let Joe, if you want to have a quick overview, I guess.
Well, I'll kind of do a lead up, and then I'll let Dave run with it. But Paige was part of 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines under Hannikin, and they had been on the east side of the perimeter when they got word that there was going to be a big Japanese attack coming from the south to the north and from the west towards the east. So they got in there late at night in the middle of a driving rainstorm, and they set up their positions to thwart the Japanese advance. And the Japanese were coming from the south to the north from basically the foothills of Mount Austin. And Paige talked about, like, during the night they could hear the Japanese, they could see the Japanese using like fluorescent type of devices. They could see those, they were like fireflies coming in their direction. Then they could also hear the Japanese down below. But Dave's walked that, I've walked that, and but I'm gonna turn it back over to Dave to kind of give you a little bit more of a flavor of what the Japanese were going to do during that attack.
If you could put the larger, I guess, Google map back up. I mean, I've got better ones that show the actual units, but maybe I can guide you through. So if everyone looks, you see Point Cruz to the left, that little position it juts out. The Matanical River is right below it. In fact, that area there, a lot of people think of, when they think of Guadalcanal, think of Bloody Ridge, Alligator Creek, but the most sustained and deadliest or bloodiest parts of this whole 6-month campaign was around that Matanical and Point Cruz area. That area was fought over for months and months and months. And then you have Mount Austin with the army down south, where hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about it. But basically, this was the largest Japanese, in fact, it was the last Japanese offensive in the Pacific War, last large offensive. So the Japanese had tried twice. They tried it Alligator Creek with basically a reinforced battalion. Then they tried it Bloody Ridge with a reinforced brigade. Then they said, okay, now we're going to throw a whole reinforced division at these Marines. So they had a good plan. So the plan was at the mouth of the Matanical River, they were going to take a regiment supported by a number of tanks. Then they were going to push across the Matanical, the mouth of Matanical, pinning the Marines down and making it look like that was their main attack. At the same time, they had the bulk of the 2nd Japanese Sendai Division. They'd made a southern route. They'd cut a big jungle doing the Murayama Trail. That was the name of their division commander. And what they were going to do was cut a trail. They call it a road, but it was just a track way far south, miles and miles south. And they were going to come up and attack Bloody Ridge. And that was their main attack. They're going to hit Bloody Ridge with a main assault with about 9,000 troops and take the airfield. And at the same time, there was a reinforced battalion was going to cross the upper part of the Matanical, and they were going to swing around on the ridge line where Paige it was, because the Marines at that time, Vandegrift had put 2 forward deployed battalions and a fishhook manning the Matanical line, because they didn't want the Japanese to bring their heavy artillery across as a staging area, because that's what the Japanese wanted to do. They wanted to push their tanks and wanted to push their heavy artillery, which was the Pistol Petes. And some people think Pistol Pete was a single artillery, but Pistol Pete was synonymous for all the Japanese large artillery pieces and the small artillery pieces that brought on island. But they wanted to keep the Japanese away from that part of the river. So that became the front line. So they deployed 2 battalions up there and had like a fish hook. But that ridge was unexposed. And just like Colonel Mueller or Joe said, basically the Marines, their intelligence didn't pick up these 9,000 Japanese punching through the jungle, or even the local Solomon Island scouts, which is unheard of because those guys are pretty good. So they missed the Japanese coming up. So when the Japanese started building up at the mouth of Matanical, at Bloody Ridge, you had the 2nd Battalion of the 7th Marines and the 1st Battalion of the 7th Marines hooked in at this stage with the 164th North Dakota National Guard, the first Army units had landed. So they were manning the nursery line, they called it at the time, to take from a World War I expression, Alligator Creek. So Vandegrift takes 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines, moves them up on that exposed ridge to keep the Japanese from cutting off his 2 battalions. So unfortunately, like all the Japanese attacks, they were uncoordinated piecemeal. The attack was supposed to happen on the night of the 22nd, but that was delayed. The night of the 21st, that was delayed because Murayama, the 2nd Division commander, said, look, we're still stuck in the jungle. We're nowhere near our attacking points. So it delayed it another night. The Japanese did send a few tanks over at one stage, and they were 2 were taken out. So the night the 23rd was supposed to be the attack night. It's supposed to be coordinated, all 3 elements. And like I said, it was a good plan if it worked, but unfortunately it was uncoordinated and piecemeal. So I guess the guys on the mouth didn't get the word, so to speak. So they punched out, I think, on the night of the 23rd with the massive attack across the mouth of Matanical with their tanks. So all the tanks were taken out. And basically, the whole regiment was destroyed by Marine artillery. And then the night of we'll talk about later with Basslong, the night of the 24th and 25th, the Japanese attacked. Once again, they had 3 regiments to go, but they only attacked 1 regiment at a time. So the night of the Paige was the night after. So the night of the 25th and 26th. So that was the 3rd attack by the Oka Regiment. And they hit that Paige line, or Paige's Ridge, or Kohler Ridge, as they call it nowadays. And yeah, so that set the stage. So Paige battalion was attacked by roughly a reinforced Japanese battalion, about 1-on-1.
And this is the what's interesting is this is where Paige actually grabs the machine gun, a 30 caliber machine gun, very hot barrel, right, and moves out in front of his troops on the reverse slope of the ridge. And this is what wins him the Medal of Honor. Do I have that anywhere near correct, Dave?
Yes. Now, John Basslong, probably one of the most famous Marines to this day. I mean, I think every Marine recruit learns about Basilone from day one at Paris Island or San Diego. Basilone earned his medal, and by studying both actions, I mean, both actions well deserved the Medal of Honor. But I think Paige, a lot of people don't know about Paige other than Marines and people that really study the military history.
And
I think first, yeah,
and Pittsburghers.
in Pittsburgh. I think Paige's his actions, to me, were more remarkable than Bassilone's, because Paige actually did hold a ridge by himself. Because once a Japanese attack, if you go to that position, you can really kind of see it on my videos. But Paige's position was put on a knoll, and the knoll was very exposed. It isn't like a linear, nice and straight line. It was a knoll, and his knoll was the center of focus for all the Japanese. Well, the Japanese going to hit the main attack. So he almost had like a 180 degree shooting on both sides. So he was very exposed. And the first Japanese wave come through, they beat him back. The second Japanese wave come through, and they overran his positions, killed and wounded all of his gunners. And then F Company, which was in support of, they basically bugged out, he said. They moved back. He said he was so mad, he grabbed the rifle and took a shot at him where the other Marines were booking out. Yeah, he says that, and he's got a good book on his memoirs, and he mentions that. So he said, I've got to do something. So he jumped on the guns, and he started firing. And he would move from gun to gun on that knoll. And because he said at one stage, his was the only automatic weapon firing on the Marine side. He says, and because of that, all the Japanese gunfire started coming toward him. So when the Japanese overran him, they ran to the battalion command post, and he knew the battalion command post was behind him. So at one stage, he flipped the gun around, took it off its traverse and elevation device, that's the thing it attaches to the tripod, free gunned it, swung it behind him, and he was firing. And the Marines thought the Japanese had fired, got a hold of the Marine machine guns. But the next day when they went through, and it looked, a lot of the Japanese had bullet holes through their backside, so to speak, and the back of the legs, where he was getting them into grazing fire. But then at one stage, he went to the nearby company, grabbed a couple of guys, grabbed a couple of machine guns, and they were holding it off. And then Major Connolly, which is battalion commander at the time, with 4 battalion commander, took some cooks and clerks, and they've staged a counterattack. And when when Paige seen them running down the hill, he picks up the heavy machine gun from the tripod, and he yells to the other guys to the right, come join me. And they ran down the slope, and he led a counterattack holding a machine gun. Now, Basilone did not fire the machine gun free-handed. Paige did fire the machine gun free-handed. And that's in Basilone's own testimonies, and we can talk about that a bit later. But yes,
it's where the miniseries,
amazing what he did.
It's where the miniseries, sort of conflates the two characters right out of convenience, and shows Basilone doing what Paige actually did.
Yeah.
So let's pause there. Any comments or questions on Mitchell Paige and his action to win the Medal of Honor? Joe, you actually met Mitchell Paige and walked him through the battlefield.
Yeah, I met him in 1977. That was the first trip I took to Guadalcanal, and he was our tour guide. One of the things Dave and I have spoken about quite a bit is the fact that, unlike today, where the machine guns are attached out, Mitchell Paige's machine gun and Basilone's, those were heavy machine guns. They came from like a weapons company, And they weren't as integrated in the fire plan for these battles. Well, I don't know about, not so much Basilone, but in Mitchell Page's case, they were kind of Johnny-come-latelys to get up on the ridge, and Paige didn't really have a lot of interface with the infantry company commander. And that's what Dave's talking about. When they pulled back, they more or less left them there. And the machine guns were more on the flanks than they really were in the center of the company line. And in this particular battle and in other battles on Guadalcanal, the thing you have to remember, I didn't cover it last time, is what Vandegrift had and the Japanese didn't have was Vandegrift had internal lines of communication. Right. So in other words, he could shift those infantry battalions around pretty quickly inside his perimeter, whereas the Japanese were at a disadvantage. They were attacking externally, and Vandegrift was defending internally, and it allowed him to concentrate his forces at key positions, whereas the Japanese had to pretty much fumble, stumble, and regroup in the jungle. And the key to the Battle of Guadalcanal and all the battles that I and Dave and probably Jeff will talk about is just some little acronyms called MET, which is Mission, Enemy, Troops, and Terrain. And then they added a W on that. And then also later they added TSL, Time, Space, and Logistics. But that's the key to all these battles, is the Japanese really did not have effective communications, radio-wise or anything else, when they launched these attacks. And that's why they failed. Had they done a real concentrated effort, they could have possibly succeeded in a number of these battles. But again, it was all done piecemeal. And of course, they were defeated in detail as a result of that. But the key in these battles with the Marines versus Japanese is internal versus external lines of communication.
Right. The Japanese tried to pull off this three-pronged attack without the ability for each prong to communicate with the other.
That's correct. And even though they had a unified commander in each of these particular cases, he was not able to effectively coordinate and communicate with his subordinate leaders. And the one thing about the Japanese plan was it was a violation of what Dave talked about earlier, or in last week's meeting here, is KISS, keep it simple, stupid. Their plans were extremely complicated. And the other thing that they didn't have, that the Marines and the Army had throughout the Pacific, is if their leaders were killed, that is, the Japanese leaders were killed, they were almost catatonic. They could not function. Whereas in the case of the Marine Corps, you could get all the way down to the private PFC level and have a PFC run in a rifle company if it got down that far. Whereas the Japanese, because of their mindset, et cetera, they were not able to adapt in a fluid situation.
That's where you get into the different cultures involved, right?
Right.
Very centralized command.
Well, again, in the interest, this is all great. In the interest of time, let's move on to Basilone. Unless, Ellie, does anybody have their hand up for a question?
I don't see anybody's hand, no. Should we play the John Basilone video here?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Good morning. I'm walking to an area which I've been requested, and I was going to do in the later episodes, but I thought I might as well do it. That's Bloody Ridge, by the way, I'm walking on. It's called the John Basilone position. Eastern Spur. Where he earned his Medal of Honor. So right now I'm walking on the actual Eastern Spur, Bloody Ridge, going down into his position. So it's only a roughly 15-minute video. If you want to know more about the Basilone Medal of Honor incident, I encourage you to read as much as you can about it. It's quite an amazing effort he did. So I hope you enjoy. So this position was occupied on October the 24th, 25th, 26th, 1942 by the 1st Battalion of the 7th Marines, which is, some of you might know, as Chesty's Pullers Battalion, and also had a very well-known Marine called Platoon Sergeant John Basilone, who's machine gun section leader. So what area I'm walking down now is basically, I think it's going to be called the Sector 3 track. Now, Vandergrift, the division commander, had his sectors divided up, defensive sectors, and Sector 3 was this southern sector on the line. And I'll show you in a map. But this sector here had a Sector 3 trail. It was an avenue of approach for the Japanese. I'm actually looking south. You can't see anything, it's jungle, but that's looking south, and that's the direction of the Japanese attack. So they're coming from that direction, roughly 3 regiments, and they attacked over 2 nights. So my previous episode of Coffin Corner, I talked about how they attacked heavily on the second night at that location. But the first night, they attacked, I guess, in dribs and drabs due to the thick jungle, and they lost their unit cohesion. So they attacked roughly platoon to company strength piecemeal. So they allowed the Marines, who are at this stage, we're only 500 men covering something like 2,500 yards, because the 2nd Battalion, the 7th Marines, were all pulled out and was put on a place called Cola Ridge, which is closer to the Mantanaco. So during the time of the battle, the 7th Marines regimental anti-tank unit with its 37 millimeters was positioned in this location. And John Basilone and his 2 machine gun sections were supporting those 37s and covering this avenue of approach. I'm walking even with the Marines lines, so I'll just move straight in and see if we can find some bunker positions. This is thick jungle floor, so over the years a lot of stuff accumulated in them, so they don't stand out as much as the ones on the Cola Ridge. So I don't know if you're able to see it. Actually positioned in front of us. And there's some ones up here become a bit more clear. You can see how thick this jungle is. Even during the time of the battle, the Marines were stuck down in here in this thick jungle, and they would cut 100-yard and 75-yard firing lines, or firing lanes they call them. They also had something like a 4-foot wide and about 6 foot high triple and quadruple apron of barbed wire. They were hoping the Japanese would just snug up on that and they could take them out with machine gun fire. So we're coming up to the Basilone position. The great and late John Ennis, the Australian historian who actually lived on Guadalcanal for 20 years, designated this was the Basilone position, and I spent a couple of weeks just one-on-one with John, and I corresponded him from 2009 to his death of last year. He brought me down to this position. This is what is known as the Basilone position. A number of people have visited this spot, and you can see it's quite a large hole. And you're supposed to have 1 machine gun section of 2 heavy machine guns in this hole. If I pan around, that hole I just showed you almost connects. So if this is the Basilone position, you probably would have had possibly 1 machine gun in there and 1 machine gun in there. When I first visited this position, and some people would actually visit and they say, oh, this position, because I'll orientate you for you, that's straight out looking toward the front lines. The Japanese would attack in that direction there. So some people say, well, this position, if you look at the orientation of the bunker, it's facing that way. If you know anything about machine guns and the placement of machine guns, they're put in an enfilade or oblique fire, so they fire from the side. So that starts to go up the Bloody Ridge right in front of us, and I'll walk that way on the way out. There's several machine gun bunkers there, so if you had a machine gun bunker here, their field of fire would have been directly in that direction. You'd have probably been cross-firing from a couple other ones up on that hill there. And I'll go over here, this other bunker. Its orientation is in that direction. So another crisscross. So here we are looking from the Japanese point of view to the Basilone bunker. So Basilone bunker is about 34 feet, 35 feet directly in front of us. Now, the Marines had, like I said before, 2 or 3 lines of barbed wire. And I'll show you one strand, or remnant, not strand, really a pigtail left in the ground. You barely see it. Right here. That's the remnant. Most time of the year, this place is just covered with water, so I picked a dry time to come down and show you guys. All right, in Basilone's own statement, he gave about 7 months after the battle. He gave it to 2 Marine officers in Quantico, and it's a written statement, and I've got that statement. He basically says the Japanese, or the barbed wire, was roughly 30 feet in front of him. So this correlates with the evidence here. I know there's been several bits of evidence located in this spot alone. From, I guess you could say, impacted bullets, Japanese buckles, fragments, and everything. So, if this wasn't Basilone's position in front of us, it's very, very near it. But there's a lot of fighting going on right where I'm at right now. And Basilone said after the battle, there was about, I think, 36 Japanese, maybe 34 Japanese between the barbed wire line and his bunker alone. So walk back to the Basilone bunker.
Dave, you think this is a reasonable spot?
Yes. And their fields of fire, he said he could.
Okay. Yeah, I've seen this now, I don't know, 4 or 5 times. It goes on. It's fascinating. It goes on for another 10 minutes, but we just don't have the time to show it all. Dave, I'll open with one question. The jungle as it appears in that video, is that fairly close to what it would have been like in 1942, or would it have been denser, or how would it have been different?
It would have been roughly the same, with the exception you've had the banta trees, the big large trees. I guess the virgin forest in there. A lot of veterans talk about the big large trees in there. The thickness, Basilone basically said he had 2 bunkers, and they're about 30 yards apart, and he said he could see roughly to about 30 feet to the line and about another 25 to 30 feet on the other side of the line. So you're looking at maybe 50 to 60 feet, or sorry, maybe yards. They would cut firing lines in, and the firing lines would be 75 to 100 meters. They'd cut them at angles, hoping that the Japanese, when they come through, would take the path of least resistance, walk straight into the firing lane, and be cut down by automatic machine gun fire, or a 37 millimeter anti-tank gun with the canisters. But to answer your original question, yeah, the terrain was very thick in there, and it's very swampy. I spoke to a veteran of the 164th Regiment, and he told me he was in there for about two months, because the 164th, and the second night of the battle, the first night of the battle, the 3rd Battalion 164th was brought in, was led by the battalion chaplain, by the Marine battalion chaplain, walked down the supply track, and they were just dropping them in the holes. 1 Army guy, 1 Marine guy, bang, 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 for the first night. And you could tell the difference, because the Army infantrymen had the M1 Garands, which fired 8-round clip, and the Marines still had the 03 Springfield bolt actions. And the amount of fire actually went up on that night as soon as they put the Army in. And then the next night they consolidated the lines. So the Marines battalion would move up on Bloody Ridge, and the 3rd Battalion of the 164th Army took over that line. And then they remained in there for a while, and they kept rotating back and forth. That area is quite unique, because every bunker almost had a machine gun in it. Because Vandergrift had visited that area a week or 2 before and said, this is a machine gunner's paradise. Puller in his record said it's only about 50% completed, the fortifications. But you think, how do they get so many machine guns? But what the privates would do, the Marine privates would go back to the aircraft graveyard, which wasn't too far back, because you had Fighter 1 in Henderson, and they'd grab a machine gun off a crashed plane. And they'd walk down the track, and the other Marine privates, which, I was one myself, I could tell, hey, where'd you get that machine gun? Oh, I found it off that plane back there. Oh, I'll go get me a machine gun. So almost, I got this old boat action rifle. I want a machine gun. So all that had machine guns. So almost bunker had a machine gun in it. So it's quite unique.
Were the ones off the aircraft, were they 50 calibers?
Oh, mainly a lot of 30 calibers. But in that line, you had, with the regimental. You had 50 cals, you had 30 cals, you had you had the light machine guns, the M1919, which is 30 cal. Then you had heavy machine guns, and then which are the water cooled, like I showed in the photo. And then you had the 50 cals, which is the big guns, still in use today. And then you had the anti-tank special weapons units, or the regimental, with the big shotguns. They call them 37 millimeters, which covered the avenues of approach. And the Japanese, when they attacked company size, and they would take the path of least resistance. So there was 2 tracks in there. And the next night at a battle called Coffin Corner, which is, especially the U.S. Army, they killed over like almost 1,000 Japanese in a big open field at Coffin Corner.
And what was the role of artillery in stopping the Japanese attacks? Was there much artillery, or was it all mortar fire?
Oh, there's a lot of artillery. In fact, in the Battle of Bloody Ridge, that's probably what saved the day. That and the Marine determination with the Raiders and the Paramarines and the engineers and the infantry guys. But the big factor was artillery, and they had all pre-registered that whole area. So the Marines had brought a whole artillery regiment with them. You know, you had the 11th Marines, which was artillery to this day. The 11th Marines are an artillery regiment. And there was a couple of batteries of the 10th Marines, which is part of the second. They accompanied the 2nd Regiment. But yeah, they because it was a defensive perimeter, they had a lot of time to move their artillery around. Like Joe said, the benefit interior lines, they could move the artillery around very quickly. And that was the contributing factor. Because I was reading one Japanese diary in the Battle of Coffin Corner. He said that his whole machine gun platoon was wiped out before he could even get to the attack point by artillery.
And these would largely have been what, 75s and 105s for the Marine artillery regiments, or?
At that stage of the battle, yes, the 75s and 105s were there. The 155s, which is the heavy stuff, was left in New Zealand initially because, you know, they didn't have the tonnage. When they brought all the ships over, they just way too much with their accompanied trucks, so they just left them in New Zealand. I think they didn't arrive. I'll have to double check it. Probably late October, early November. Yeah, with the Army brought the 155s, and then they could do the counter battery fire with the pistol Petes, because when the pistol Petes with the heavy Japanese artillery was 100 and 150 millimeter, when they started firing, the Marines didn't have any counter battery that reached that far. Yeah.
The whole artillery, the role of the artillery in World War II, not just Guadalcanal, is again something which maybe doesn't get spoken about as often as it should, because it played so many key roles in so many World War II battles, infantry battles. Where, okay, I'm sensitive to the time. We're at 8:30. Any questions in the chat room about Basilone? Anybody have their hand up that you'd like to ask a question?
Trey, I see you have a question. Want to go ahead and ask it?
Yes, I do. I wanted to ask Mr. Holland about the tank presence, because he did mention tanks at Guadalcanal. And I was wondering, I'm familiar with the Japanese tanks that were there, like Chihas, Shohos. But at this point in the war, I'm confused at which American tanks were there. Were they not Chaffees, those were way later, but were they Stewarts? Were they Lees? Were they Shermans? Were they M3 MGCs? What American tanks were there?
Yep, that's a good question. So at that stage, the 1st Marine Tank Battalion had basically M3s and M2 Stewarts, or light tanks. It wasn't until 1943 that the Shermans started being introduced into the 1st Marine Division. I think they used them at Cape Gloucester. I'll have to double check it. But especially for the Guadalcanal campaign, it was only the Stewart light tanks. And they were used quite often. There's one battle called the Battle of the Overland Trail. It's on one of my videos, and they were actually did an attack with 6 Stewart tanks, and 3 of them were taken out by the Japanese anti-tank. And in the Battle of Gavutu on 7th of August, there was 2 taken out at Tanimbogo. Sorry, Gavutu, Tanimbogo. It was 2 taken out. They were actually swarmed by the Japanese and taken out by iron pipes and flames and things like that. But yeah, to answer your question, it was the M3 and the M2 Stewarts.
Thank you, Dave. There is one question in the chat room I see from a BF Graham. What was the one key element that enabled Basilone to be successful that night?
I can answer that one. The one thing, the Marines had the fixed positions like I mentioned before, and they had the enclosed bunkers. Unlike the Pacific series, all the bunkers were closed with coconut logs bunkers. Well, Basilone, he fired one gun actually from a prone position. He'd roll 2 feet over into the bunker, but they had good fixed positions that had been in there for a long time. You had the artillery behind it fixed in. The Japanese attacked piecemeal and company size down avenues of approach that the Marines had covered with artillery, machine guns, and 37 millimeters. And then you had people like Basilone and Paige and a lot of those other, I think I mentioned before, the 7th Marines was initially fitted out with the most experienced leaders. And then you had guys who studied machine guns, like Basilone. He lived and breathed machine guns. He was he was in the U.S. Army before the war, and he was a machine gunner. When he went into the Marine Corps, he was a machine gunner. He lived and breathed machine guns. That's all he knew, and he could effectively run those machine guns. In fact, Basslong, he shot those machine guns by himself that night, and he had his guys covering him to the sides, but he ran those machine guns. And and even when the Japanese were running around him, he had a 45 laying right beside him the whole time. And he would pick the 45 up every once in a while and shoot a Japanese behind him when his Marines would say, hey, Johnny, there's a Japanese behind you. They'd probably use another term, but he'd end up shooting with a 45. And he'd put the gun right behind him. But he maintained. The thing about Basslong, which is so amazing, you had the whole line, bunkers. You can imagine how confused it was, Japanese running left and right through there. At one stage, he had to go back and get ammunition. So instead of running behind him, because the Japanese behind him, he ran out in front of the lines, in front of all those machine guns, bunkers, all the Marine shootings are in, through the Japanese lines, back and entered back through the same way the attacking Japanese did. Is quite amazing. But yeah, to answer the original question, it was, all those factors led to the defeating the Japanese quite thoroughly.
Sounds like a Medal of Honor action to me.
Yes, very much so.
Okay. There's really two more things we want. Dave, thank you very much for your comments there. Your knowledge of this is just exquisite. Joe as well. And Jeff Raker, I'm sorry we haven't been able to bring you in too much into this.
I'm learning along with the rest of you guys, learning from the best.
So there's just two more pieces to tonight's program. Connor, are you still with us tonight?
Connor, if you could go ahead and unmute.
Yes.
If you're, oh, there you are. Hello.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, before we get to you, Connor, I'm going to ask you to come on after this one next question. So bear with us, okay? So,
Yes, sir.
So, as I think you said, Dave, and maybe Joe, Jeff, this battle really effectively ends the Japanese offensive assaults on the perimeter. But this is by far not the end of Guadalcanal. Dave, you mentioned the actions, which I was not aware of the U.S. Army Regiment, part of the Americal Division, I'm guessing, that played in the Basilone action. And sometimes, again, just like we forget the 2nd Marine Division, we forget that the U.S. Army is involved here. But to try to put a finish on this, on the campaign in 30 seconds, the 1st Marine Division is withdrawn in December, and the Army continues to pour in more personnel. I think a 25th Division, if I have that right? And eventually it's the Army which finishes off the campaign. So could I ask Joe, Dave, Jeff, Raker, comment on the role of the U.S. Army in finishing the campaign by, what is it, the end of January 1943 that the Japanese evacuate?
Now, that was last week of February when the evacuation was completed, and they landed a regiment actually to the east of Cape Esperance, and they linked up with the Army units that were heading that were moving from the west to the east, but somewhere over by and Dave helped me out here, somewhere over either by White River, or they might have gone as far as the Poha. You had an organization called the CAM, and that was Combined Army Marine Division, where you had the 2nd Marine Division, but they only advanced up as far as White River, which is to the east of Cocambona. And then you have the 25th Division, which is operating up in the hills, where you see the thin red line, where you see Galloping Horse Ridge, Seahorse Ridge, Snakeback, and it was the Army's objective was to clear the high ground to the east when they finished up with Mount Austin, which was December 42, late December 42, January, early part of January 43, and then they continued on a westward march. But if we had the big map of Guadalcanal up, you'll see it's intersected by rivers running south to north at the coast, and each one of those river crossings, and stream crossings, which there were dozens, those would have been highly contested, what you call a FIBA, forward edge of the battle area for the Japanese. So they fought all the way back till they got up to the area of Doma Cove, and in that area up there, actually at the eastern edge, if you will, of Cape Esperance is where the last were evacuated, and I believe that is like February 6th in that time frame in there, and that's where the final evacuation of the Japanese came from. And when the two forces met, and I just can't think of the name of this little village that's on the north coast of Guadalcanal, when they both met, they were somewhat stunned by the fact that there was no Japanese left, that the Japanese had pulled out. And the Japanese, the way they were coming down with their destroyers, the Army, Marine Corps, the United States thought that there was going to be another push in February. They thought it was a reinforcing action, not a withdrawing action. So the Japanese were able to pull off that action, and I believe they moved their troops up to the Shortland Islands, where they isolated them because they didn't want them talking to any of the other Japanese forces in the area, because the Japanese were afraid that defeatism would spread through the ranks.
Right. So, I mean, this is where, I don't know if Jeff Ballard is still on the line. I know he had to, at some point, leave for a personal engagement, but
I'm here, Glenn.
This is where the naval part of this, right? We finally begin to win the battle of the seas, if you will, and the Japanese realize they cannot continue to pour resources into Guadalcanal because now we're ruling the waves. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think it was in mid-December. I want to say December 16th that the emperor finally agreed to evacuate Guadalcanal. There was the Battle of Tasa, Flaranga, which occurred on the last days of November 1942. That was the Japanese at this point had the only tactic they had left was to put supplies into barrels and push the barrels overboard and hope that the troops on the island were strong enough to be able to paddle out and recover the supplies. At that point, it was a rescue mission, or it was they'd given up any hope of winning. And we're just trying to, it was a humanitarian, that's the word I was looking for, humanitarian mission.
Yeah, because I think they still left quite a few Japanese troops behind.
Yeah, they were encouraged, if they couldn't walk, they were encouraged to shoot themselves.
Yeah. Okay.
Can I mention one thing about the Army?
Of course, Dave.
I'll be remiss if I didn't. Yeah, the U.S. Army is underplayed. And in fact, the 2nd Marine Division's underplayed. But one unit of the U.S. Army, the 25th Infantry Division, the Marical Division you mentioned, but the one unit that a lot of people that studied Pacific War don't know about is the 147th U.S. Army Regiment. They were the last regiment to land there. They were the last ones to push up, as Joe said, up the coast. But after this session, please have a look at the history of the 147th Regiment. They fought in Iwo Jima. People said, oh, all Marines fought in Iwo Jima. No, the 147th was there too. And they just didn't do mop up. They did a lot. And they also fought in a number of other engagements. I think they were actually at Okinawa too. They're just amazing, this 147th Regiment. And I forgot what they called themselves, like the Orphan Regiment or something. They were all over the Pacific, these guys. So I didn't really know about it until I started studying the Guadalcanal campaign in depth. So the 147th Regiments, I have to give a shout out to those guys.
Excellent. Thanks. Excellent. Thank you. So we're going to end this here, except for Connor's ending piece here. But let me thank our 4 guests one more time. You've all been incredibly generous with your time, and your knowledge is just incredibly impressive. And Dave, Jeff, and Joe, we thank you very much for sharing so readily with our audience. And
hey, Glenn,
we hope we come up with some other Pacific campaigns to talk about here in the future.
Yeah, hey, Glenn.
Yes, sir.
Just real quick, somebody asked me about my background here. That's the White Shepler's art that I use.
Yeah. Very distinctive. Very nice. Okay, so let's end this with Connor. Connor, we've been ending quite a few of our programs with your comment. Connor, for those of you who have not heard him before, is a young man who is incredibly focused on finding surviving, living World War II veterans and interviewing them. He's done quite a number of them. Connor, how many of these interviews have you had, and who are we going to talk about tonight for a few minutes?
I have interviewed 21 so far. It's about to be 23 because I'm working on 2 interesting veterans along the way and working on some more. Matter of fact, I've heard that you like talking about World War II, especially fighter pilots. Matter of fact, 2 of the veterans I've interviewed were pilots. My great-grandfather was a pilot. Well, I'll speak about him later on tonight, but the one veteran I'll be speaking about is Jim Frolking, Frolking.
Okay.
Now, Jim Frolking, who's from Ohio, Cleveland Heights, he served as a fighter pilot with the 479th Fighter Group called Riddle's Raiders. The commanding officer was Kyle Riddle, Riddle, and his first mission was actually D-Day, June 6th of 44. Basically, what he did in that mission is he helped patrol sea lanes when they didn't see actual combat. But he had a great respect for his officers. Matter of fact, after his commanding officer was shot down, they brought in Hub Zemke from the 56th Fighter Group, who has set an unbelievable number of records from the group, and he said he became an ace 2 or 3 times himself, so quite famous. And another ace that he most respected from a different squadron, you may know heard of his name, Robin Olds, Olds.
One of the fought through World War II, Korea, and Vietnam.
Yes, correct. He's told me about him. The thing that he's told me about him is he is a West Point football graduate. His dad was a general, and Owens was the squadron commander of the 434th, and now he had a high amount of respect for him. He had a high amount of respect for General Owens, and General Owens was wing commander F4 Vietnam. As a full bird colonel, he had that mustache. Told some commander of his told him to shave it off, and he later became commandant of the cadets for the Air Force Academy and became one-star general.
Connor, this Jim, pronounce his last name again, Froking?
Froking, Frolking.
How did you get in contact with him?
Well, George Champa, who's a good friend of mine, who's also D-Day and Battle of the Bulge veteran, he is a documentarian for Let Freedom Ring for All, and he has sent me emails. That's how I got Dennis Thompson, who I spoke about yesterday. He's got me in touch with Jack Gutman, who I'll be speaking with him tomorrow, who's Navy Corpsman. But anyways, I got a couple of photos of my great-grandfather, and Jim is now 97 now and is sharp as a tack. This is my great-grandfather when he was Air Force.
Back that off just a little bit. Back up. There you go. Okay. Wow.
Now, if you have any questions about him, I'll feel free to answer. I know quite a bit about him, about his background and his service and all that.
And his name again?
Oh, his name? Fred, Fred Wilson, Wilson. But his middle initial is the letter F, like the alphabet.
Your great-grandfather. And,
yeah.
And he fought in what campaigns in World War II? What he was a fighter pilot?
No, he was bombers.
Bombers. Okay.
Matter of fact, his unit was attached to 8th Air Force in Europe, and he spent his time in Germany most of the time and survived a great deal. Matter of fact, his last unofficial mission was Normandy as well before the invasion. So he's told us quite a story. As a matter of fact, his Baltic gunner actually got the Purple Heart for a very rare reason. He accidentally wet his pants in a unfortunate state and got frostbite in his wiener and got Purple Heart for it. I think he will go down the history to one of the first men from the 8th Air Force to ever get a Purple Heart from such a thing.
It reminds me of some of my college fraternity stories, but we're not going to talk about that here.
No. His family is pretty huge. He grew up on a farm in Ringgold, Louisiana, and you'll be pretty surprised how many children he was one of. He was number 9 out of his family.
Yeah, yeah.
And
your great-grandfather, I'm assuming he's no longer with us. Is that correct?
Oh no, he's passed away about 16 years ago, and geez, he'd be 102 years old if he was alive. So he'd be old as heck.
That's my mom's age, so be careful. She's still with us.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
My great-grandfather has a friend who's about to be 102 in September.
Well, Connor, you continue to amaze me with your ability to research all this and find these people and talk to them. And we're really, really pleased that you share this with us. Does anybody have any questions or comments of Connor at this point?
Glenn, this is Don Patton.
Hey, Don.
World War Roundtable in Minnesota.
Yeah, guys.
If you could give me Connor's address, I'll mail him a book. We had a triple ace from Minnesota who raised on a Wisconsin farm, went in the Air Force, Army Air Force, flew P-51s, P-47s, ended up being a triple ace. He came back and started something of a hearing aid, which is now Miracle Ear.
Oh.
He sold the hearing aid to Miracle Ear, and he then took the the money from that sale and invested in Buffalo Wild Wings. So unbelievable person. And we had him speak twice on our program. And I'd like to send the book that he published about his life and World War II to Connor, just he's no longer living.
Okay.
But, anyway, I'd like to do that.
Yeah, Connor, you have my email address, or Ellie's perhaps. You get us your information and I'll get it to Don.
Yes.
Yeah, we can definitely get you guys in touch.
Okay.
As a matter of fact, my great grandfather actually was one of 14 children. He was number 9 out of his family. But most of them are dead now, except for one. He's probably 90 now and lives in Texas.
Well, listen, Connor, thank you very much for sharing this, and we hope to have you back on future programs. And we appreciate what you bring to us, and really admire your desire to research all this and share it with us. So we're going to sign off now. I promised myself we'd be done before 9, and we just have squeaked it in. I want to thank everybody for joining us, and for our experts for contributing such great knowledge with us. And we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you, Ellie, for your help too.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.